Lena
What the hell
Whitfield
happened?
sat
Who
alone in
did
the
this?
corner booth of
I don't
Haggerty's
know.
Diner,
It happened so
watching the
fast.
rain trace
We need
crooked
to know.
lines down the window glass. The coffee in front of her had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she hadn't noticed. Her fingers rested on the manila folder that contained the life of an 8-year-old boy she had never met, and the weight of that folder felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. The diner smelled like bacon grease and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and followed you home. Lorraine, the waitress who had been working the afternoon shift at Haggerty's for longer than most people could remember, moved between tables with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen every kind of trouble walk through that door. She refilled coffee cups without being asked, cleared plates before they cooled, and kept one eye on the weather through the streaked windows. Outside, the small town of Ridgeline, Oregon, sat under a bruised sky. The clouds had been building since morning, stacking themselves like gray stones over the mountains to the west, and now the rain had settled in with the patience of something that intended to stay. Lena opened the folder again, though she already knew every word inside it. Colton Decker, 8 years old, brown hair, brown eyes. 3rd grade at Ridgeline Elementary when he bothered to show up. His attendance record looked like a half-finished crossword puzzle, more empty squares than filled ones. His teacher had written a note in careful handwriting that said Colton was bright but withdrawn, that he flinched when adults raised their voices, that he sometimes fell asleep at his desk with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with staying up late watching television. His mother had not been seen in 14 days. The neighbors had filed the reports. Empty bottles collecting on the porch like glass soldiers. Strange cars at odd hours. The sound of crying through thin apartment walls, and then silence, which was somehow worse. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pemberton, had told the intake worker that she had seen Colton taking food from the dumpster behind the convenience store 3 days in a row. He had been wearing the same shirt each time. Lena pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose and closed her eyes. She had been a social worker for 12 years, and in that time, she had learned that every case file was a door. Behind some doors, you found situations that could be repaired with patience and the right resources. Behind others, you found damage so deep that all you could do was stand in the wreckage and try to keep the walls from falling on whoever was still inside. She had also learned that the system was a machine built for processing, not for saving. It moved children through foster homes and group facilities and courtrooms like packages on a conveyor belt, stamping their files with dates and case numbers, while the children themselves grew older and quieter and harder to reach. Lena had watched it happen dozens of times. She had stood in fluorescent-lit offices and argued for more time, more funding, more attention, and she had watched those arguments dissolve against the institutional indifference of a system designed to manage problems rather than solve them. But she kept coming back. She kept opening the folders and reading the names and driving to the addresses because 12 years ago, she had made a promise to someone who could no longer hear it. His name was Darren, her brother, 26 years old with a laugh that could fill a room and hands that shook when he thought no one was looking. He had been using since he was 19, and Lena had spent 4 years trying to pull him back from the edge before the edge crumbled beneath him entirely. She was 23 when she got the call. A Tuesday morning in November. The detective's voice had been professionally gentle, the kind of gentle that people practice in front of mirrors, and Lena had listened to every word while staring at a spot on the kitchen wall where the paint was peeling. She did not cry that day. She cried 3 weeks later in the shower with the water running so hot it turned her skin red. And when she was done crying, she dried off and sat at her kitchen table and filled out the application for the social work program at Portland State University, because she could not save Darren. But maybe if she moved fast enough and cared hard enough, she could keep someone else from disappearing. That was the promise. Not to the world, not to any god or institution, to Darren. At her elbow, coffee pot in hand. Refill at her elbow, coffee pot in hand. Refill hone, she asked, already pouring. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world in that folder. Lena managed a thin smile. Just the weight of one little boy. Sometimes that's heavier, Lorraine said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she knew exactly what she meant. She topped off the cup and moved away, leaving Lena alone with the steam and the rain and the photograph of a child with missing front teeth who smiled at the camera like he still believed good things were possible. Lena took a sip of the fresh coffee and turned to look at the diner's other occupants. The place was mostly empty for a Tuesday afternoon. An older man sat in the far booth with a newspaper folded to the crossword, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. A retired couple shared a piece of cherry pie near the front window, their conversation soft and unhurried. And a few tables away, an elderly woman sat with a boy who looked about 7 or 8. The woman had the careful, attentive manner of a neighbor doing her best with someone else's child, cutting his pancakes into small pieces and watching him eat with a concern that went beyond casual kindness. The boy himself was thin, wearing a flannel shirt that was too big for him, the sleeves rolled up past his wrists. His hair needed cutting, and there were shadows under his eyes that no child his age should carry. But he was eating, and that seemed to be enough for both of them. The boy caught Lena's eye and waved with the tentative shyness of a child who was not sure whether strangers could be trusted. She waved back, and something tightened in her chest. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that he was the reason she was sitting in this diner, that his file lay open on the table in front of her, that his face in the school photograph matched the face now looking at her from across the room. She only knew that he reminded her of every child she had ever tried to save, and that the ache she felt when she looked at him was the same ache she had carried for 12 years. Instead, he was somewhere in Ridgeline alone, or close to it, waiting for a mother who might never come back, and a system that would process him like a number if Lena could not find another way. She was still thinking about this when the front door of Haggerty's diner exploded inward. The sound was enormous. Wood splintered and glass cracked, and the little bell above the door flew across the room and hit the wall behind the counter with a sharp metallic ping that was somehow louder than the crash itself. Lorraine dropped the coffee pot, and it shattered against the floor in a burst of brown liquid and broken glass. The retired couple froze mid-bite. The old man with the crossword looked up slowly, his face blank with the particular confusion of someone whose routine has just been shattered beyond recognition. They came through the doorway like a wall of leather and muscle. 5 of them at first, then more behind their boots, heavy on the wooden floor. They wore vests covered in patches and insignia that Lena recognized immediately from police briefings and newspaper headlines. Hell's Angels, the real ones. Not weekend warriors playing dress-up on rented Harleys, but the genuine article men who wore their colors like a second skin and carried themselves with the coiled authority of people who had long ago stopped caring what the world thought of them. The man at the front was enormous, 6'4" at least, with shoulders wide enough to fill the door frame and a beard that was more gray than black. His eyes swept the room with the practiced assessment of someone who had walked into 1,000 rooms and cataloged every threat in each one before most people had finished flinching. A patch on his vest read Bear, and beneath it the word President was stitched in thick gold thread. The diner's atmosphere changed instantly, like someone had sucked all the warmth out of the air and replaced it with something electric and dangerous. Customers pressed themselves into their booths. Lorraine backed against the counter, her hands searching behind her for the phone she kept beneath the register. But the bikers did not advance. They spread out along the wall near the entrance, taking positions that seemed both casual and strategic, and the big one, the bear, raised one hand in a gesture that might have been intended as reassurance. Then a different kind of chaos erupted. A man Lena had not noticed before, sitting in a booth near the back, suddenly lurched to his feet. He was younger than the bikers, maybe 30, with a shaved head and the jittery energy of someone running on chemicals and bad decisions. His face twisted into something ugly as he recognized the patches on the bikers' vests. "You ain't welcome here," he shouted, and his hand went to his waistband, and Lena saw the gun before her brain had time to process what it meant. Everything that happened next occurred in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The young mother at the nearby table screamed. Her son, the boy who had waved at Lena moments ago, went rigid in his seat, his pancake fork frozen halfway to his mouth. The shaved head man's gun came up sweeping wildly between the bikers and the rest of the room, and Lena's body moved before her mind gave permission. 12 years of walking into dangerous homes. 12 years of stepping between angry parents and frightened children. 12 years of putting herself in the space where harm was about to land, because that was the job, because that was the promise, because every child she could not save wore Darren's face in her nightmares. She did not think. She launched herself from the booth, crossing the distance to the boy in 3 strides, and wrapped her arms around him. She turned her back to the gunman and pulled the child against her chest, curling her body around his like a shell. The first bullet hit her between the shoulder blades with the force of a sledgehammer. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent a white flash of pain through her entire body. The second bullet struck lower to the left of her spine, and she felt something crack that she knew was not supposed to crack. The third hit her right side just below the ribs, and the fourth caught her shoulder as she was already falling. She went down hard, her arms still locked around the boy, her body still between him and the gun. The floor of Haggerty's diner was cold against her cheek, and she could feel the boy trembling against her chest, his small fingers clutching her shirt, his breath hot and fast against her neck. The diner seemed to tilt sideways, and sounds began to fade, the screaming, the heavy boots, the crash of furniture being overturned. Someone was shouting orders in a deep voice that rumbled like an engine. The last thing Lena saw before the darkness took her was the boy's face, his eyes wide and wet and terrified, staring at her like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had just come apart. She wanted to tell him it would be all right. She wanted to tell him she was not going to leave. But her mouth would not work, and the darkness was patient, and it took her without asking permission. The wail of approaching sirens pierced the gray afternoon as paramedics rushed into what was left of Haggerty's diner. Harlan Decker stood like a granite pillar beside Lena's crumpled form, his massive frame casting a shadow that covered her entirely. Blood had pooled beneath her body, spreading across the checkered linoleum in a slow, dark tide. "She's got a pulse, but it's fading." One paramedic announced, his hands moving with the speed of someone who understood that seconds were the difference between a person and a body. "Multiple gunshot wounds to the back. We need to move now." Harlan watched them work. His weathered face carried an expression that most people would not have been able to read, but the men who knew him would have recognized it immediately. It was the look he wore when something had reached past his defenses and touched the part of him he kept locked away. The woman on the floor, this stranger who was not his family and owed his world nothing, had thrown herself in front of bullets meant for a child. She had done it without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the careful self-preservation that survival demanded. She had simply moved, driven by something that Harlan understood in his bones, because he had spent 20 years in the company of men who lived and died by the same instinct. You protect the ones who cannot protect themselves. That was the code. It was supposed to be his code. And this woman, this small woman bleeding on a diner floor, had lived it more purely in a single moment than most of his men had in their entire lives. Her social worker's badge had fallen from her pocket during the chaos. He bent down and picked it up, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he turned it over. Lena Whitfield, Department of Child Services. The photograph on the badge showed a woman with steady eyes and the kind of determined mouth that suggested she had spent her career walking into rooms that other people walked out of. "Boss," Pip, one of his younger riders, approached with caution. "The shooter's been handled. Cops are coming." "What about the kid?" Harlan turned to look at the boy. He sat in a booth nearby, trembling and silent, his face streaked with tears, and his eyes fixed on the blood spreading across the floor. The elderly woman held him, her arms wrapped around the boy, more for her own comfort than his, her face blank with the shock of someone who had only meant to buy a child some pancakes and had walked into a war instead. The boy stared at Lena's still form with an expression that Harlan had seen before on the faces of children in Afghanistan who had just watched the world prove that safety was an illusion. But there was something else in the boy's expression, something that went beyond fear. He was looking at Lena the way a drowning person looks at a hand reaching down through the water. "Pip, take 6 men and clear a path for that ambulance." Harlan said, his voice carrying the low, certain authority that 20 years of leadership had built into every syllable. "I want a straight run to the hospital. No delays." He turned to Dawson, his second in command. "You and Moose stay with the boy and his mother. Keep them safe until the cops clear the scene." "Cops are going to have questions," Dawson pointed out. "Then give them answers. A civilian got hurt protecting a child. We were having coffee. That's the truth mostly." Harlan's gaze returned to the paramedics who were lifting Lena onto a stretcher with the urgent care of people who knew they were losing the race. Right now, the only thing that matters is that woman. She doesn't die today. Not on my watch. In that Ridgeline County Hospital, fluorescent lights washed everything in shades of pale green as medical staff rushed Lena through the emergency entrance. Harlan stood in the lobby, rain still dripping from his beard, watching until the stretcher disappeared behind double doors marked "Surgery" in block red letters. "Your people need to wait in the designated area," a nurse told him, her voice professional but strained by the effort of maintaining composure in front of a man who looked like he could tear the building down with his bare hands. Harlan nodded once. "We'll behave, but we're not leaving." His men were already taking positions throughout the waiting room. Fielding claimed a cluster of chairs near the main entrance. Red leaned against the wall by the emergency exit, his arms crossed and his eyes alert. Moose sat in the children's corner, his enormous frame dwarfing the tiny plastic chairs, looking like a mountain that someone had accidentally placed in a preschool. Other visitors moved away from them instinctively, the way small animals move away from predators, not because they were being threatened, but because every instinct told them to make room. When Pip arrived with the boy and his mother, the boy was still crying. Quiet, steady tears that ran down his face without sound, the kind of crying that children learn when they have discovered that loud crying does not bring help. Pip guided them to seats near the center of the group, surrounded on all sides by leather and muscle, and the boy did not flinch away from the bikers. He barely seemed to notice them. His eyes remained fixed on the surgery doors, waiting for some sign that the woman who had saved his life was still on the other side of them. Harlan pulled Dawson aside. "Get our contacts working. I want to know everything about Lena Whitfield, where she lives, where she works, any family, any enemies, and find out who that shooter was connected to. This wasn't random. Someone wanted blood today, and I want to know why." "What about the woman?" Dawson asked. "If she makes it through surgery, she's going to have questions." "She'll have answers," Harlan said, "but first she has to make it through surgery." He settled into a chair with a clear view of both entrances and the surgery doors, and he waited. The bikers waited with him, saying little, adjusting nothing, their presence filling the waiting room like something solid and immovable. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the boy continued to cry, and the clock on the wall measured the distance between hope and its absence, with the slow, merciless precision of something that did not care about either. The first thing Lena became aware of was pain. Not the sharp, specific pain of injury, but a deep, spreading ache that seemed to radiate from her back through every cell in her body, like her skeleton had been replaced with something made of hot glass. Her eyelids were heavy, and the simple act of drawing breath sent a line of fire along her ribs that made her want to stop breathing entirely. She could hear sounds, but they came from a great distance. Heavy boots on a hard floor, the beep of medical equipment, a low voice saying something she could not quite make out. She tried to piece together what had happened. The diner, the gun, the boy's terrified face pressed against her chest. Everything after that was a blur of sirens and voices and a darkness that had swallowed her whole. Lena forced her eyes open and immediately closed them again. The light was wrong. Not the harsh fluorescence of a hospital, but something dimmer, filtered through dusty windows set high in walls that were made of brick and exposed steel. She tried again, blinking until the room came into focus, and what she saw made no sense at all. The ceiling above her was industrial. Exposed pipes ran in parallel lines and metal beams crossed the space at regular intervals. She lay on what was clearly a proper medical bed with rails and an adjustable back, but it sat in the middle of what appeared to be a converted warehouse. An IV drip hung from a metal stand to her left, and a heart monitor beeped steadily beside it. But beyond these familiar objects, everything was wrong. "Take it easy." The voice came from her right, deep and rough, like gravel being poured into a barrel. "Doc says you need to stay still." She turned her head, and the movement sent a spike of pain through her neck that made her gasp. The man beside her bed was the biggest human being she had ever seen at close range. He sat in a metal folding chair that looked comically small beneath him, his arms crossed over a chest that was roughly the width of a small automobile. His beard was neatly trimmed gray, with streaks of black, and his leather vest was covered in patches that she could now read clearly. "Bear, President. Hell's Angels." "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a cracked whisper, her throat so dry it felt lined with sandpaper. "Somewhere safe." He reached for a water bottle with a straw and held it to her lips with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the size of his hands. Hospital wasn't secure. People were asking questions that didn't have good answers. "I'm Harlan, by the way. Harlan Decker. Most folks call me Bear." Lena took a small sip of water and let her eyes move around the room. As her vision adjusted, details emerged from the dim light. The space was enormous with high ceilings and brick walls stained by decades of industrial use. The medical equipment beside her bed was clean and modern, incongruously professional against the rough backdrop. And the people. They stood throughout the room like sentinels posted at the boundaries of a kingdom. Men in leather vests and heavy boots, their arms crossed, or their hands resting at their sides in postures that managed to be both relaxed and instantly ready. Some sat in chairs, others leaned against walls or support columns, but all of them watched her with expressions that mixed wariness with something she did not expect. Respect. She counted them without moving her head, at least 20, maybe more in the shadows beyond her line of sight. The boy, Lena managed, remembering the reason her body was filled with fire. The boy from the diner, is he safe? He's right here, Harlan said softly, and he shifted his massive frame to one side. In a worn armchair that someone had pulled close to her bed, a small figure sat with his knees drawn up to his chest. He was thin with brown hair that needed cutting and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone his age. He wore clothes that were too big for him, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up and jeans cinched with a belt that had extra holes punched in it. When his eyes met Lena's, his entire face changed. The guarded expression broke open and something desperate and hopeful flooded in behind it. "You're awake," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "Harlan said you'd wake up. You saved me from the bad man. You're like a real superhero." Lena tried to smile, though the muscles in her face felt like they belonged to someone else. "Are you okay?" The boy nodded, but the motion was too fast, too eager, the kind of nodding that children do when they want you to believe them. "I'm Colton. Are you going to stay awake now? You've been sleeping for a really long time, and I was scared you weren't going to wake up." "You've been out for 3 days, Harlan said from behind the boy, his voice low and measured. "We had to move you when some unfriendly people started showing interest at the hospital. Don't worry, we've got a real doctor coming by regularly. A man named Griff used to be an army medic in the Gulf War. Knows his business. You're healing well, considering." 3 days. Lena processed this information through the fog of pain and medication. 3 days unconscious, and she had been moved from a hospital to a warehouse by a motorcycle gang. The professional part of her brain, the part that had been trained to assess danger and identify risk factors, was screaming that this was wrong, that she needed to call the police, that she was in the custody of violent criminals and needed to extract herself immediately. But another part of her brain, the part that had learned to read rooms and people, and the spaces between what was said and what was meant, noticed other things. The medical equipment was clean. The IV bag was properly hung. The men around the room, despite their intimidating appearance, maintained a respectful distance from her bed. And the boy Colton had clearly been sitting in that chair for a long time. His blanket was tangled around him, and there were cracker crumbs on the armrest, and a small collection of items had accumulated on the floor beside the chair. A toy truck, a crayon, a stuffed bear with one missing eye. "All of you," Lena said, letting her gaze move across the room. "You've been watching over me. You took bullets protecting an innocent kid," Harlan said. His voice was simple and factual, as if he were stating the most obvious truth in the world. "That means something to us. You're under our protection now, whether you want it or not." She would learn later what those words cost him and how much they meant to the men who heard them. But in that moment, lying on a medical bed in a warehouse surrounded by 20 Hells Angels, Lena Whitfield felt something she had not expected to feel. Not safety, exactly. The pain in her body and the strangeness of her situation prevented anything as simple as safety, but something adjacent to it, a sense that whatever happened next, she was not alone in it. Colton scooted his chair closer, and his small hand reached for hers. His fingers were warm and slightly sticky, the way children's fingers always are, and they wrapped around her hand with a grip that was far stronger than his size suggested. "I was so scared, Mommy," he whispered. "But Harlan said you'd be okay." The word hit Lena like a sixth bullet. She looked at Colton, then at Harlan, then back at Colton. "Sweetheart, I'm not your mommy. I'm a social worker. I help children, but I'm not—" "Yes, you are." Colton's grip tightened. His lower lip trembled, and tears welled in his eyes with the sudden force of a dam breaking. "You saved me like a mommy would. You got hurt to keep me safe. That's what mommies do." "Colton, honey, No." The shout echoed through the warehouse, bouncing off the brick walls and metal beams. Colton launched himself from the chair and wrapped his arms around Lena's neck, and the pain that shot through her body was eclipsed by the pain in the boy's voice. "You're my mommy now. You can't leave me like she did. Please don't make me go away. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. Harlan stood slowly, his shadow falling across the bed like a curtain. Easy, buddy, he said, his voice impossibly gentle for a man his size. Remember what we talked about. Miss Lena needs to rest. You're hurting her. Colton loosened his grip but did not let go. He buried his face against Lena's shoulder, and she could feel his tears soaking through the thin cotton of her shirt. His body shook with the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it has no bottom. Please don't send me away, he whispered. And the words were so small and so broken that several of the bikers in the room turned away, finding sudden interest in the walls, in the floor, in the darkness beyond the windows. Lena's professional training told her this was not healthy, that Colton was exhibiting classic trauma bonding behavior, projecting his unmet attachment needs onto the first person who had shown him protection and care, that he needed counseling stability, a structured environment with trained professionals who could help him process what had happened. But her professional training had not taken 4 bullets for this child. Her professional training had not held him while the world fell apart around them. And her professional training could not feel the desperate tremor in his small body or hear the raw need in his voice, the need that said, I have been alone for so long, and you are the first person who stayed. She lifted one arm, ignoring the fire in her shoulder, and placed it around Colton's back. She could feel his heartbeat against her ribs, fast and frightened and young. I'm not going anywhere, Colton, she said quietly. I promise. Harlan watched them from his chair, and something shifted behind his eyes, something old and heavy that he kept buried beneath the leather and the authority and the careful distance he maintained from anything that could hurt him. He said nothing, but his hand moved to his vest pocket where a creased photograph lived in the dark, and his fingers pressed against it like a man touching a wound to see if it still hurt. It did. The days that followed reshaped Lena's understanding of the world in ways she had not anticipated. She had spent her career on the other side of the line that separated law-abiding citizens from the people who lived outside that boundary. And everything she knew about motorcycle gangs came from police reports, news coverage, and the cautious briefings that social workers received when their cases overlapped with dangerous territory. The men in those briefings were described as violent, unpredictable, and organized around a hierarchy of intimidation. They were obstacles to be navigated, threats to be assessed, dangers to be avoided. What the briefings never mentioned was the way a man named Moose, who stood nearly 7 feet tall and had hands like dinner plates, could sit cross-legged on a warehouse floor and build a tower of wooden blocks with an 8-year-old boy, adjusting each block with the precision of a jeweler setting stones. They never mentioned that Fielding, who had once managed a portfolio worth $40 million on Wall Street before the crash of 2008, stripped him of everything, including his family would bring Lena fresh soup each morning in a chipped ceramic bowl, apologizing every time for the fact that his cooking was not as good as his mother's. They never mentioned Red, whose real name Lena never learned, who had taught high school English for 22 years before his only son died in a car accident, and the grief drove him so far from his old life that he could never find his way back. Each man carried his story like a scar. Griff, the medic, who checked Lena's wounds twice daily, had served in the Gulf War and came home with skills that no civilian employer wanted and memories that no civilian could understand. He changed her bandages with hands that were steady and careful, and when he was finished, he always said the same thing. You're healing good, ma'am. Better than most. Whatever you're made of, it's strong stuff. Bite, the youngest member of the group, had been an IT specialist at a startup that collapsed under the weight of its founder's fraud. He handled the gang's communications and security with the quiet competence of someone who found machines more trustworthy than people. And he had set up a monitoring system around the warehouse that would have impressed any law enforcement agency in the state. And then there was Harlan. He moved through the warehouse like a weather system, his presence felt before he was seen. The men responded to him with a respect that went beyond the hierarchy of rank. They listened when he spoke, not because they feared him, though they did, but because he had earned the right to be heard through years of decisions that put their welfare above his own. He checked on every man during his rounds. He remembered their families, their problems, their weaknesses. He gave orders sparingly and praise even more sparingly, but when either came, they carried the weight of absolute sincerity. He told Lena pieces of his story across several evenings sitting beside her bed while Colton slept in the armchair. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan after the towers fell back, when he was old enough to know better, but still young enough to believe that serving his country would give him the purpose he could not find at home. He came back from the second tour with a Purple Heart, a titanium plate in his left forearm, and a marriage that was already dying from the distance he had put between himself and everything soft. "I had a daughter," he said one night, his voice low enough that only Lena could hear it. The warehouse was quiet around them, most of the men sleeping or standing watch outside. Rain tapped against the windows high above, and the medical equipment beeped its steady rhythm. Her name was Jolene. "She was the best thing I ever made, and I failed her in every way a father can fail." He pulled the photograph from his vest pocket and held it under the light. A girl of about 12 smiled from the creased paper, wearing a softball uniform and clutching a trophy that was almost as big as she was. She had Harlan's strong jaw and her mother's eyes, and the smile on her face was the kind that comes from a child who still believes her father can fix anything. "Her mother died in a car accident when Jolene was 10, Harlan continued. "I was deployed at the time. Left Jolene with her aunt, figured it was the responsible thing to do. Serve my country, set up a future for my kid." He was quiet for a moment. "By the time I came back, she was someone else, angry, running with people who saw her pain and used it. She was 16 when she started using, and I tried everything. Rehab, counseling, tough love, soft love. Nothing took. Last time I saw her, she was stealing from my wallet and calling me names that would have gotten anyone else put through a wall." He tucked the photograph away. "That was 3 years ago. I haven't seen her since. Don't even know if she's alive." Lena understood then why Harlan had taken her in, why he had posted 20 men around her bed, why his voice went soft when he looked at Colton. He was not just protecting a stranger who had done a brave thing. He was trying to rewrite a story that had already been written to prove that it was possible to keep someone safe when everything in his experience told him it was not. She reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, mapped with scars and old tattoos, and she could feel the tension in his fingers, the coiled strength that he kept leashed through sheer will. He did not pull away. He did not speak. But his hand turned beneath hers, and his fingers closed around her own, and they sat like that in the dim light of the warehouse while the rain fell and the monitors beeped, and Colton dreamed whatever dreams 8-year-old boys dream when they are safe enough to sleep. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after the shooting. Lena had been sitting at a small table near her bed helping Colton with a simple jigsaw puzzle when her phone buzzed with a text from Karen Ostrowski, her supervisor at the Department of Child Services. The message was 3 sentences long, and each one felt like a door slamming shut. "DCS has flagged Colton Decker as missing. Active search underway." "Where are you?" Lena stared at the screen and felt the ground shift beneath her. She had known this was coming. The system did not lose track of children without eventually noticing, and Colton had been off the grid for nearly a week. Someone had filed a report. Someone had checked the records. And now the machinery of Child Protective Services was grinding into motion, and once it started, it did not stop. She looked at Colton, who was carefully fitting a blue piece into the corner of the puzzle, his tongue sticking out in concentration. He looked up and caught her watching him. "What's wrong, Mommy?" The word still sent a crack through her professional armor every time he said it, but she had stopped correcting him. Not because she had accepted the title, but because every time she tried to explain that she was not his mother, the fear in his eyes was so absolute and so devastating that she could not bring herself to add another loss to the inventory of losses he was already carrying. "Nothing, sweetheart, just a work message." But it was not nothing, it was everything. That same afternoon, the second threat materialized. Pip came running into the warehouse with a crumpled piece of paper, his face pale beneath his road tan. He handed it to Harlan without a word, and Lena watched the big man's expression darken as he read. His jaw clenched, and the muscles in his neck corded like bridge cables under strain. "What is it?" she asked, pulling Colton closer. Harlan walked over, his movements controlled, but radiating a tension that made the air around him feel compressed. "The rival crew, the ones connected to the shooter at the diner. They're run by a man named Wade Prescott." He held up the paper. "This is a message they want us to hand you over. They're saying what happened at the diner made them look weak, and they want to make an example." Lena's stomach dropped. She felt Colton's fingers tighten on her arm. What kind of example? The kind that doesn't matter, Harlan growled, because it's never going to happen. He turned to his men who had gathered at the sound of his voice. Double the perimeter. Nobody comes within a mile of this place without us knowing. Fielding, get on the scanners. Bite, I want eyes on every road in and out of Ridgeline. The warehouse erupted into controlled activity. Men checked equipment, made calls, moved into positions with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit. Lena watched them and felt the reality of her situation close around her like a fist. She was being hunted by a violent gang leader. The Child Protective System was searching for the boy in her care. She was recovering from 4 gunshot wounds in a warehouse full of Hell's Angels. And the only people standing between her and catastrophe were the very people that the rest of the world considered criminals. That night, after Colton had fallen asleep in the armchair, with his stuffed bear tucked under his chin, Lena made the phone call that would either save everything or destroy it. She sat in the warehouse kitchen, a windowless room in the back, with a steel table and 3 mismatched chairs. The phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed the number for Janet Paulson, the one colleague at DCS whom Lena trusted without reservation. Janet had been a social worker for 28 years and had learned the same lesson Lena had, that sometimes the system was the threat, and the only way to protect a child was to work around it. Janet picked up on the 3rd ring. Lena, where the hell are you? Karen is losing her mind. There's an APB out on the Decker boy. I know, Lena said, keeping her voice steady. I need you to listen to me, Janet. Really listen, because what I'm about to ask you could end both our careers. Silence on the other end. Then carefully, I'm listening. Colton Decker is safe. He's with me. But if CPS takes him right now tonight, he goes into emergency placement. A group home if we're lucky. Some stranger's house if we're not. And this kid, Janet, he's been through something that would break most adults. His mother abandoned him. He watched a woman take bullets to save his life. He's attached to me in a way that pulling him away right now could cause damage that no amount of therapy will fix. Lena, you can't just... I'm filing for emergency foster placement. Tonight, I meet every qualification. My background check is clean. My home study was approved 2 years ago when I considered fostering. I need you to push the paperwork through before Karen flags this as a kidnapping. The silence stretched. Lena could hear Janet breathing, could almost hear her thinking, weighing the rules against the reality, the system against the child. You know what you're risking, Janet said finally. I know what I'm risking if I don't. Another pause. Then Janet sighed, and in that sigh, Lena heard the sound of a woman who had spent 28 years watching the system fail children and had finally been asked to do something about it. Send me the paperwork. I'll have it on the judge's desk by morning. Lena hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, feeling the adrenaline drain from her body and leave behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She had just gambled her career, her freedom, and possibly her future on the belief that she could navigate a system she had spent 12 years serving from a warehouse full of outlaws. When she walked back to the main room, Harlan was standing by the window, his silhouette massive against the faint glow of the parking lot lights outside. He turned when he heard her footsteps. You've been on the phone, he said. It was not a question. I filed for emergency foster custody of Colton. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's a big move. The system is looking for him, May. If they find him here with your men, they'll take him, and I'll never get him back. But if I'm his legal foster parent, I have standing. I have rights, and I have time to figure out the rest. Harlan crossed his arms, the leather of his vest creaking. And if it doesn't work, then I'll find another way. She met his eyes without flinching. I didn't take 4 bullets for that boy, just to watch the system swallow him whole. Something changed in Harlan's expression. The guarded assessment gave way to something warmer, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were seeing in her a quality he had been searching for without knowing it. You've got guts, Whitfield. I'll give you that. Guts aren't enough, she said. I need time. Your men can protect us from Wade Prescott, but the state of Oregon is a different kind of enemy, and bullets don't work against paperwork. Harlan was quiet for a moment, then he nodded slowly. We'll buy you the time, whatever it takes. And Harlan. She paused, choosing her next words with care. I need to know everything. Who the shooter was, why Wade Prescott wants Colton, And what you're not telling me about that boy? The question hung in the air between them. Harlan's face went still, and for just a moment Lena saw something flash behind his eyes, a pain so deep and so old that it had become part of the landscape of his face, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. "There are things you need to hear," he said slowly, "but not tonight. Tonight you need to rest. Tomorrow I'll tell you what I know." He walked her back to her bed, his heavy boots quiet on the concrete floor. Colton stirred in his sleep as she settled in, reaching one small hand toward her without opening his eyes. Lena took his hand and held it. "Mommy, Bem," he murmured, and then he was still again, his breathing deep and even. Harlan stood over them both, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then he turned and walked back to his post by the window, resuming the vigil that he had kept every night since the shooting, watching the darkness outside for threats that he could see and fighting the ones inside him that he could not. Lena lay in the dark, listening to Colton breathe, listening to the rain, listening to the steady footsteps of men on watch. Her back throbbed with every heartbeat. Her mind raced with calculations and contingencies, and the growing certainty that whatever Harlan was hiding would change everything. But for now, in this moment, she held Colton's hand, and she did not let go. The attack came at 2 in the morning when the darkness outside the warehouse was so complete that the world beyond the windows might as well have not existed. Lena had been sleeping lightly, the way she had learned to sleep since the shooting, her body never fully surrendering to rest because the pain in her back kept pulling her to the surface like a hand reaching up through water. Colton was curled against her side, his small body radiating heat, his breathing steady and deep. The stuffed bear with the missing eye was pinned between them, a cotton sentinel standing guard over a boy's fragile peace. The first sound was wrong. Not the familiar creak of boots on concrete as the night watch made their rounds, but something sharper, something that came from outside the walls. A metallic snap like a bolt being cut, then another, then a third. Harlan's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "They're coming through the fence, east side, everybody up." The warehouse erupted. Men who had been sleeping on cots and folding chairs were on their feet in seconds, moving with the muscle memory of people who had rehearsed this scenario in their minds every night. Lights stayed off. Flashlights clicked on their beams, cutting through the dark in controlled sweeps. Someone handed Lena a heavy jacket, and she pulled it on without thinking, already reaching for Colton. The boy woke instantly, his eyes wide and blank with the particular terror of a child who has learned that the worst things happen when it is dark. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply reached for Lena and held on. "The tunnel," Harlan said, appearing beside her bed. His voice was calm, but his body was coiled with a tension that Lena could feel radiating off him like heat from an engine. "Moose knows the way. He'll take you and Colton through to the old textile mill on Granger Street. There's a van waiting. What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Harlan was not going to be right behind them. He was going to stay and fight because that was what he did, and because 20 men were looking to him for direction, and because somewhere outside those walls Wade Prescott was coming to take the boy and the woman that Harlan had sworn to protect. Lena did not argue. There was no time for arguments. She lifted Colton, settling him against her hip despite the fire that blazed along her healing wounds, and followed Moose toward the back of the warehouse where a heavy steel door led to a concrete stairwell. They were halfway down the stairs when the first explosion shook the building. The sound was enormous, a deep concussive boom that Lena felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. Dust rained from the ceiling and the stairwell lights flickered and died. Moose caught Lena's arm in the darkness, steadying her with a grip that was firm, but careful the way you might hold a bird you did not want to crush. "Keep moving," he said. His voice was steady, which was remarkable given that the building was shaking around them. They reached the bottom of the stairs and turned into a narrow corridor that smelled of old concrete and standing water. Behind them, above them, the sounds of combat filled the building. Gunfire in short, controlled bursts. The crash of breaking glass. Men shouting to each other in the clipped language of people who had no time for complete sentences. And beneath it all, the rumble of engines close and getting closer, pressing against the walls of the warehouse like something alive trying to get in. The tunnel entrance was a hole in the wall at the end of the corridor, hidden behind a sheet of plywood that Moose pulled aside with one hand. The tunnel beyond was barely wide enough for his massive shoulders, and the darkness inside it was absolute. "Take him," Lena said, pressing Colton into Moose's arms. The giant biker looked at her with confusion. What are you doing? There are men hurt up there, I heard them. That's not your fight. Lena looked at Colton, who stared back at her with eyes that contained every fear an 8-year-old should never have to carry. She kissed his forehead. Go with Moose, sweetheart. I'll be right behind you. You promise? I promise. Mommy, please don't leave. I'm coming right back, Colton. But there are people up there who need help, and helping people is what I do. It's what mommies do. She did not wait for a response. She turned and ran back down the corridor, her bare feet slapping against the wet concrete, the pain in her back screaming with every stride. Behind her, she heard Moose say something to Colton in a low, soothing voice, and then the sound of movement into the tunnel, and then nothing but the chaos above. She found them in the main room. 2 of Harlan's men were down. Fielding lay against the base of a concrete pillar, his leg bent at an angle that nature had not intended, his face gray with shock. Near the east wall, a younger biker whose name Lena did not know was pressing his hand against a wound in his side that was leaking blood between his fingers at a rate that made Lena's stomach clench. Smoke filled the upper half of the room, drifting in thick layers beneath the industrial ceiling. Through the haze, she could see muzzle flashes near the main entrance, where Harlan and the bulk of his men had formed a defensive line. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire and shouting and breaking things that compressed the air until it felt solid. Lena dropped to her knees beside Fielding. Can you move? His eyes focused on her with difficulty. My leg. I know, I'm going to drag you. It's going to hurt. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He outweighed her by at least 60 pounds, and every inch of ground she gained sent bolts of agony through her half-healed back. Fielding groaned through clenched teeth but did not scream. She dragged him 10 feet, then 15, then 20 until they were behind a stack of steel drums that provided at least some cover from the bullets that were chewing chunks out of the brick walls. Then she went back for the other man. He was worse than Fielding. The wound in his side was deep, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that Lena had seen before in emergency rooms, the color of someone whose body was beginning to prioritize which organs to keep running. She tore a strip from her jacket and pressed it against the wound, holding it there with both hands, while the building shook around her. Stay with me, she said. Look at me. What's your name? Webb, he managed. Webb, you're going to be fine, but you need to keep pressure on this. Can you do that? He nodded weakly, and she placed his hand over the makeshift bandage. She was about to go back for more material when Griff appeared through the smoke, his medical bag slung across his back, moving in a low crouch that spoke of military training that the years had not erased. What the hell are you doing here? He demanded, already pulling supplies from his bag. You should be in the tunnel. I sent Colton with Moose. These men needed help. Griff looked at her for a long moment, his face lit by the strobing light of muzzle flashes. Whatever he saw in her expression, it ended the argument. He turned to Webb and began working with the focused intensity of a man who had patched soldiers together in desert field hospitals and was not about to lose anyone in a warehouse in Oregon. The fighting lasted another 40 minutes. When it ended, the silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. Wade's men pulled back as quickly as they had come, their engines fading into the distance like a receding storm. Harlan's men held their positions for another 10 minutes, waiting for a second wave that never came before the tension in the room began to slowly uncoil. Lena sat on the concrete floor, her back against the steel drums, her hands covered in Webb's blood and her body shaking with the after effects of adrenaline. Harlan found her there. He stood over her for a moment, his leather vest torn and his face streaked with soot, looking down at her with an expression that mixed anger and admiration in equal measure. You were supposed to be in the tunnel. Your men were bleeding. You could have been killed. I've already been shot 4 times, Harlan. I know what I can survive. He stared at her. Then something that might have been a smile crossed his face, brief and reluctant, like sunlight through a crack in a wall. He extended his hand and pulled her to her feet. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the craziest. Most days it's both. The aftermath of the attack was quiet and bitter. 3 of Harlan's men were wounded, none fatally, but the warehouse had taken significant damage. Bullet holes cratered the brick walls. 2 windows were shattered. A section of the east wall had been breached by whatever explosive Wade's crew had used to blow through the fence. The medical supplies that Griff had carefully organized were scattered across the floor, and the generators that powered the building that were running on fumes. But the physical damage was not what poisoned the air in the days that followed. It was the question that no one wanted to ask, and everyone was thinking. How did they know Wade's crew had hit the warehouse at the weakest point in the perimeter? They had timed their attack during the shift change when the number of men on watch was at its lowest. They had known about the east wall, which was the oldest section of the building and the most vulnerable to breaching. None of this was information that could be gathered from the outside. Someone had given it to them. Harlan called a meeting 3 days after the attack. Every able-bodied man gathered in the main room, their faces hard and their postures rigid with the particular tension of people who suspect they are standing next to a traitor. Lena sat at the edge of the gathering, Colton sleeping in the room behind her with Donna watching over him. She had not been invited to the meeting, but no one told her to leave, and she understood that her presence had been accepted as a fact of life that was no longer worth questioning. "Someone talked," Harlan said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room with the weight of absolute authority. "Someone in this room gave Wade Prescott information that almost got people killed. I want to know who, and I want to know now." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against the skin. Men looked at each other with eyes that searched for guilt, and what they found instead was the reflection of their own suspicion, which was almost worse. Trust once questioned cannot be unquestioned. It is like a window that has been cracked. Even if it still holds, you can see the fracture lines and you know it will never be as strong as it was before. Bite stepped forward. The young tech specialist held a laptop in his hands, and his face carried the particular misery of someone who has found something they wish they had not been looking for. "I went through every phone, every communication, every connection point in and out of this building for the past 2 weeks, Bite said. His voice was thin and reluctant, the voice of a man delivering a verdict he did not want to pronounce. Text messages, encrypted apps, call logs, everything. He turned the laptop toward Harlan. "It's Briggs." The room went still. Every head turned toward the stocky man standing near the back wall. Briggs had been with the Hells Angels for 7 years. He had been one of the first to volunteer for guard duty when they brought Lena in from the hospital. He had carried blankets to her bed and brought her water and told her stories about his son, a boy named Jimmy, who was 9 years old and played shortstop on his Little League team. Briggs had been the one who showed Colton how to throw a baseball in the parking lot behind the warehouse patient and laughing while the boy's throws went wild. Now his face was the color of ash. "I can explain," he said, and his voice broke on the second word. "Explain what?" Harlan's question was quiet, which was worse than shouting. The quieter Harlan got, the more dangerous he became, and every man in the room knew it. "Explain the text to Wade's people. The meetings behind the bar on 5th Street, the money they paid you. They have my son." The words came out in a rush, desperate and ragged. "They found out where Jimmy's mother lives. They sent me pictures of his school, his bedroom window. They said if I didn't give them what they wanted, they'd hurt him. What was I supposed to do?" The room erupted. Angry voices overlapped, and 2 men grabbed Briggs by the arms before he could take a step. The sound of shouting filled the warehouse, bouncing off the damaged walls, and Lena watched as the brotherhood that had seemed so solid began to crack along lines she had not known existed. Harlan raised one hand and the room went silent. The speed of it was remarkable, the way 20 angry men stopped talking at a single gesture from a single man. It spoke to a depth of authority that went beyond rank or fear. These men obeyed Harlan because they believed in him, and that belief, even in this moment of betrayal, held. "Take him to the back room," Harlan said. His voice was flat and cold, emptied of everything except the calculations of a leader deciding what justice required. "Wait." Every head turned. Lena stood at the edge of the group, her arms at her sides, her face calm with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The men stared at her, some with confusion, some with irritation, and 1 or 2 with something that looked like curiosity. "You don't have a vote in this," Dawson said. "I'm not asking for a vote. I'm asking for 5 minutes." She looked at Harlan. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them that the other men could feel but not identify. Harlan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Lena walked to where Briggs stood between his captors, his face wet with tears and his body trembling with the kind of fear that strips away everything a person uses to protect themselves and leaves only the raw truth of what they are. She looked at him, and what she saw was not a traitor. She saw a father. "Your son, Jimmy, he's 9, Briggs nodded, unable to speak. Where is Jimmy's mother? Cedar Falls, 20 miles north. She has custody. I get him every other weekend. Lena turned to Harlan. Punishing Briggs doesn't protect his son. Right now, Wade Prescott has leverage over this club because he has a threat hanging over a child. You can beat Briggs bloody, and when you're done, Jimmy will still be in danger and Wade will still have his weapon. The room was silent. Harlan's expression was unreadable. I have a contact in the county sheriff's department, Lena continued. A woman named Janet Paulson, who coordinates with law enforcement on child endangerment cases. I can get Jimmy and his mother into a temporary protection program within 24 hours. Off the grid, new location. Wade loses his leverage. She looked at Briggs. In exchange, you tell us everything. Every communication, every meeting, every piece of information you gave them. Everything Wade told you about his plans, his connections, his resources. Briggs stared at her with the dazed expression of a man who has just been offered a lifeline he did not expect and does not trust. You would do that for my kid? I would do that because your kid is 9 years old and none of this is his fault, and because intelligence is worth more than punishment. She turned back to Harlan. Bullets won't stop what's coming, but information might. The silence in the warehouse lasted a long time. Harlan looked at Lena, then at Briggs, then at the faces of his men, who were watching him with the focused attention of people waiting to see which way the mountain will fall. His jaw worked beneath his beard, and Lena could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The old instincts of violence and retribution fighting against something newer, something that this woman with 4 bullet scars on her back had planted in him without him noticing. Do it, he said finally. Make the call. Briggs sagged between his captors, and the sound he made was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but something in between that contained all the relief a human being is capable of feeling. The men holding him loosened their grip, and Lena could feel the atmosphere in the room shift, not completely and not permanently, but enough. A crack had appeared in the way these men understood the world, and through that crack, something unfamiliar had entered. The possibility that strength did not always require violence. Lena made the calls that night. Janet Paulson, despite being woken at 1 in the morning and despite the increasingly complicated nature of the favors Lena was asking, came through. By dawn, a sheriff's deputy was at the door of Briggs's ex-wife's apartment in Cedar Falls, and by noon, she and Jimmy were in a protected location that Wade Prescott did not know existed. In return, Briggs talked. He sat at the steel table in the warehouse kitchen and laid out everything he had, dates and tummies and names and the particular details of Wade Prescott's organization that no outsider could have known. And buried in that information like a bone fragment in an X-ray was the thing that changed everything. Wade's got a lawyer, Briggs said, staring at his hands. A real one. Guy named Sheridan works out of Portland. Wade's been building a custody case for Colton. He's got papers that say he's the boy's biological father, and he's got a court order granting him visitation rights. It's all legal. At least it looks legal. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. She sat down slowly, gripping the edge of the table. How long has he had this? Months, maybe longer. The lawyer's been working it quiet, keeping it off the radar. Wade's been waiting for the right time to file for full custody. He doesn't want Colton because he loves him, Lena said. It was not a question. He wants Colton as a weapon, to control someone. Briggs nodded. The boy's mother, Wade's obsessed with her, always has been. Getting custody of the kid is his way of dragging her back. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was worse than Lena had imagined. This was not simply a gang war. This was not about territory or reputation, or the kind of street-level disputes that ended with broken bones and police reports. This was a man using the legal system as a weapon, turning courts and custody orders into instruments of control and abuse. And the system, Lena's system, the one she had spent 12 years serving and believing in, was the tool he was using to do it. She could fight Wade Prescott's guns. Harlan and his men could handle that. But she could not fight a judge. She could not fight a court order. If Wade Prescott's lawyer walked into a family court and presented documentation showing that his client was the biological father with existing visitation rights, and if the boy's mother was a missing addict with no fixed address and no legal representation, the outcome was not just possible. It was inevitable. Wade would get Colton, and there was nothing 20 Hells Angels could do about it. unless Lena could build a case strong enough to tear down everything Wade had constructed. And to do that, she needed evidence. The kind of evidence that Briggs was now providing: records of violence, patterns of abuse, connections to criminal activity. Every piece of information that Briggs surrendered was a brick in the wall that Lena was building between Colton and the man who wanted to use him. She spent that night organizing documents on the kitchen table, her hands moving with the focused intensity of someone assembling a weapon. Because that was what it was. A weapon made of paper and testimony and the meticulous architecture of legal argument. And for the first time since the shooting at Haggerty's diner, Lena felt something that was not fear or pain or exhaustion. She felt the cold, clear certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she is fighting for and exactly how she intends to win. Harlan found her at 3 in the morning, still working her coffee, long cold and her eyes red with fatigue. He sat down across from her without speaking and watched her sort papers into neat stacks, each one labeled and dated and cross-referenced with the precision of someone who understood that in a courtroom, details were the difference between justice and its absence. "There's something else you need to know," he said. Lena looked up. His face was different in the low light of the kitchen. The hardness was still there, but beneath it, something was shifting like tectonic plates moving deep underground. He sat with his hands flat on the table as if he needed the solidity of the steel to hold himself together. "You asked me that first night what I wasn't telling you about Colton. I remember. I've been carrying this for 3 years, haven't told anyone. Not my men, not the doctors, not the lawyers, just me and the knowledge and the guilt." He took a breath that seemed to cost him something. "Colton's mother. The woman who disappeared, the one you were assigned to find through social services." He paused, and in that pause, Lena heard the sound of a man preparing to say words that would alter the shape of his world. "Her name is Jolene Decker. She's my daughter." The kitchen was very quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant footsteps of the night watch, the soft tick of the clock on the wall measuring seconds that suddenly felt heavier than they had a moment ago. "Colton is my grandson." Lena sat motionless. The papers in her hands might as well have been written in a language she had never seen. She stared at Harlan, watching his face, and what she saw there was not the powerful gang leader or the fierce protector or the man who commanded 20 bikers with a nod of his head. She saw a grandfather. She saw a man who had been looking at his own blood for days without being able to claim it, who had stood guard over a child that carried his name without the child knowing who he was. Jolene ran from Wade 3 years ago. Harlan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to get clean for Colton's sake, but the addiction was stronger. She kept moving. Small towns, shelters, places where nobody asked questions. I looked for her everywhere. She'd come back sometimes, Harlan said, reading the confusion on Lena's face. A few months here, a few months gone. She'd get clean for a while, come home to Colton, try to hold it together. Then Wade would get close, or the cravings would get worse, and she'd disappear again. Each time she came back, she stayed a little shorter. The last time she left, 2 weeks before the shooting, she told Mrs. Pemberton next door to keep an eye on the boy. Said she'd be back in a couple of days. His jaw tightened. She wasn't. Spent every cent I had hiring people to find her. But she didn't want to be found. She was running from Wade, from her past, from me. From you. I wasn't a good father, Lena. I was gone when she needed me. I was hard when she needed soft. I thought discipline was the same as love, and by the time I learned the difference, she was already gone. His hands clenched on the table. When she left Colton alone in that apartment, she was trying to protect him. She knew Wade was getting close, and she thought if she wasn't there, he'd have no reason to come for the boy. She was wrong, but she was trying. Lena's mind was working at a speed that surprised her. The pieces were rearranging themselves, and the picture that emerged was both more complicated and more heartbreaking than anything she had imagined. Harlan had taken her in not just because of what she had done at the diner. He had taken her in because the child she had saved was his grandson, and the woman she had been assigned to find was his daughter, and the entire structure of protection and secrecy that he had built around them was driven not by the code of a motorcycle gang, but by the desperate love of a man who had already lost everything once and could not bear to lose it again. "Does Colton know?" she whispered. "He was too young when Jolene left. I doubt he remembers me, and I couldn't tell him. Not with everything else he was going through. Losing his mother, the shooting, the trauma. Adding a grandfather he doesn't remember to that pile of confusion seemed cruel. And your men, they know now. I told Dawson and Griff after the attack. They deserve to understand why I was willing to go to war over this. Lena sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. The tiredness she felt was not physical. It was the tiredness of a woman whose understanding of the world had just been dismantled and rebuilt in the space of 5 minutes. Everything she thought she knew about this situation, about Harlan, about her own role in it, had shifted. She opened her eyes. I need to meet Jolene. That might happen sooner than you think. Harlan reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his phone. He set it on the table between them, and the screen showed a text message received 2 hours ago from an unknown number. Dad, I'm clean. 6 months. I need to see my son, please. The woman who walked through the warehouse door the following evening looked like a ghost who had decided against considerable evidence to keep living. Jolene Decker was thin in the way that people become thin when their bodies have spent years serving as battlegrounds between chemistry and will. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a ponytail that revealed the sharp architecture of her face, and Lena could see Harlan in her immediately in the set of her jaw, in the way her eyes moved around the room with the assessment of someone who had learned to catalog exits before she cataloged anything else. But there was something else in Jolene's face that Harlan's did not have. Fragility, not weakness, but the particular brittleness of a person who has been broken and reassembled so many times that the glue is visible between the pieces. She stood in the doorway clutching a small duffel bag, her eyes scanning the warehouse until they found Harlan, and when they did, her composure cracked. Dad. The word was small and heavy, and it fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Harlan crossed the room in 3 strides, and his arms went around his daughter, and the sound she made against his chest was not crying exactly, but something more fundamental. The sound of a person returning to a place they thought they had lost the right to enter. Lena watched from the doorway of the kitchen, and what she felt was not jealousy or resentment, but a sharp, complicated ache that had no name. She was happy for them. She was terrified for herself. Because Jolene's return meant that the precarious structure Lena had built around Colton, the foster paperwork, the legal strategy, the careful daily architecture of love and stability, was now standing on ground that might shift beneath her at any moment. Colton was asleep. Lena had made sure of that. Whatever was about to happen, the boy did not need to be in the middle of it. Not yet. When Jolene finally pulled back from her father, her eyes found Lena. The 2 women looked at each other across the warehouse floor, and the distance between them felt much greater than the 30 feet of concrete that separated them. You're the one who saved him, Jolene said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. At the diner. Yes. He calls you Mommy. It was not a question, and the way Jolene said it, without accusation, but with the pain so visible it was almost physical, made Lena's chest tighten. He does, Lena said. I didn't ask him to. I tried to explain that I wasn't his mother, but he's been through something no child should go through, and I was the first person who stayed. The silence that followed was long enough to contain entire conversations that neither of them spoke aloud. Jolene looked at the floor, then at her father, then back at Lena. I left him, she said, and the words sounded like they had been rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark. I left him alone in that apartment because I thought it was the only way to keep Wade away from him. I was wrong, I know that. I was wrong about a lot of things. She took a step forward. But I'm clean now, 6 months. I'm in a program, I have a sponsor, a counselor, a bishop at a recovery center 2 states over. I came here because I want to be part of my son's life again. I'm not asking for everything at once. I know I don't deserve that. But I'm asking for a chance. Lena felt the ground beneath her feet shift in exactly the way she had feared. Because what Jolene was asking was reasonable. It was exactly what Lena would have recommended in any other case if she had been sitting in her office reading this situation from behind the safety of a desk. Reunification with biological parents was always the goal when the parent demonstrated genuine recovery. That was the policy. That was the system. That was what Lena herself had fought for in dozens of cases where addicted parents clawed their way back from the edge and deserved the chance to try again. But this was not any other case. This was Colton. This was the boy who called her mommy and held her hand while he slept and drew pictures of their family on scraps of paper that he kept under his pillow. This was the boy she had taken 4 bullets for the boy. She had filed emergency foster papers for the boy she had fought the system to protect. And now his biological mother was standing in front of her, asking for something that Lena's professional training said she should support, and her heart said would tear her apart. "I want to talk to her alone," Lena said to Harlan. The big man looked between them, his daughter and the woman who had saved his grandson, and Lena saw the helplessness in his eyes, the recognition that this was a battle he could not fight for either of them. He nodded and withdrew, pulling the warehouse door shut behind him with a soft click. They stood in the kitchen, the steel table between them, like a negotiating table at a peace conference. Jolene's hands shook slightly as she wrapped them around the mug of coffee that Lena had poured for her, and Lena noticed the tremor with the clinical eye of someone who had spent 12 years assessing people in crisis. "You're angry at me, Jolene said. "I'm not angry at you. You have every right to be. What I feel doesn't matter right now. What matters is Colton and what happens to him next." Jolene flinched, and Lena realized that the professional steadiness in her own voice probably sounded like coldness to a woman who had come expecting warmth. She softened. "Jolene, I believe you. I believe you are clean, and I believe you want to be part of Colton's life. But you need to understand what that boy has been through. He watched me get shot. He was alone for 2 weeks in an empty apartment before that. He has nightmares every night. He calls me mommy because I'm the first person who didn't disappear. And if you walk in there and announce yourself as his mother, the confusion and the fear could set him back in ways that would take years to repair." Jolene's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "Then what do I do?" Lena took a breath. This was the moment, the intersection of her professional knowledge and her personal pain, the place where what she knew was right and what she wanted were not the same thing, and she had to choose the first one anyway. "We do this the right way," Lena said. "Gradually, supervised visits, short meetings at first with me present. You don't introduce yourself as his mother. You're Jolene. You're someone who cares about him. We let him set the pace. If he warms up to you, we take the next step. If he pulls back, we give him space. No deadlines, no ultimatums. His emotional safety comes first." "And you," Jolene asked, "where do you fit in all this?" The question pierced something in Lena that she had been trying very hard to keep intact. She looked at the table, at the neat stacks of legal documents that represented her fight for Colton, at the coffee cup that she had been drinking from for days, at the small world she had built inside this warehouse that was about to be made larger and more complicated by the arrival of the one person who had more right to Colton than she did. "I fit wherever Colton needs me to fit," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands beneath the table were shaking. "He doesn't have to choose between us. He's 8 years old. He needs to know that there are people who stay. Not one person. People. You and me and your father and every one of those men out there who have been watching over him. That's what we can give him. Not a perfect family, a real one." Jolene stared at her for a long time. Then she nodded, and the tears that had been building finally fell, and they sat across from each other at the steel table in the kitchen of a warehouse surrounded by Hell's Angels, 2 women who loved the same child, both broken in their own way, both trying to build something whole from the fragments. The first meeting happened 2 days later. Jolene sat on the old couch in the main room, her hands clasped in her lap, her posture rigid with the effort of containing everything she was feeling. Colton approached slowly, holding Lena's hand, his eyes wary and curious. "Colton, this is Jolene," Lena said, keeping her voice warm and easy. "She's a friend. She wanted to meet you." Colton looked at Jolene with the assessing gaze of a child who has learned that new people are not always safe. Jolene smiled at him, and her smile trembled at the edges, but held. "Hi, Colton. I heard you like building things." He considered this. "Moose and me built a tower. It was really tall." "That sounds amazing. Would you show me how—" The blocks came out, and they sat on the floor together, building a tower that grew slowly and crookedly toward the ceiling. Jolene's hands were careful and patient, and she followed Colton's lead without pushing, without reaching for him, without doing any of the things that her body so obviously wanted to do. Lena sat nearby watching, and the ache in her chest was joined by something else. Something that felt like the beginning of peace. It was not resolved. It would not be resolved for a long time. But it was a start. That evening, after Colton had fallen asleep and Jolene had retreated to the small room Harlan had prepared for her, Lena sat in the kitchen with her legal documents spread before her. The court date was in 72 hours. Wade Prescott's lawyer would present his custody claim, and Lena needed to be ready. She organized her evidence into 3 folders. The first contained Briggs' testimony and the records of Wade's communications with the rival gang. The second held documentation of Wade's history of domestic violence, gathered from police reports, hospital records, and witness statements that Lena had obtained through channels both official and otherwise. The third folder was the most important. It contained the emergency foster care approval that Janet Paulson had pushed through Lena's own credentials and background, and a detailed assessment of Colton's psychological needs written by a child psychologist Lena had consulted by phone. It was, she thought, the most important case she had ever built. Not because it was the most complex, but because it was the most personal. Every page in those folders represented a piece of the life she was fighting to protect, a life that had become so tangled with her own that she could no longer tell where her duty ended and her love began. Outside the kitchen window, the night was dark and still. But somewhere in that darkness, Wade Prescott was preparing his own case. And somewhere beyond that, the machinery of the court system was grinding forward, indifferent to the human stories caught in its gears, ready to render a judgment that would determine whether Colton Decker spent his childhood in the arms of people who loved him or in the hands of a man who saw him as nothing more than a means of control. Lena closed the last folder and pressed her palms against the table. 72 hours, 3 days to finish building her wall of paper and testimony and truth. 3 days before the system she had served for 12 years would be turned against the boy she had taken 4 bullets to protect. She was ready. She had to be. Because this time the battlefield was not a diner or a warehouse. It was a courtroom. And in that room, the only weapons that mattered were the ones she had spent her entire career learning to wield. The morning of the 72nd hour began with rain. Not the gentle, indecisive rain that had been falling on the day of the shooting at Haggerty's Diner, but a hard, deliberate downpour that hammered the warehouse roof with the persistence of something trying to break through. Lena stood in the kitchen, her legal folders arranged on the steel table in the order she intended to present them, and she stared at the phone in her hand for a long time before she dialed the number. It was not Janet Paulson's number. It was not her supervisor's. It was the non-emergency line for the Ridgeline County Sheriff's Department. She had thought about this decision for 3 days. She had turned it over in her mind during the quiet hours when Colton was sleeping, and the warehouse was still examining it from every angle, the way she examined case files, looking for the weakness that would cause the whole structure to collapse. She had considered the risks, which were enormous, and the alternatives, which were worse. And she had arrived at a conclusion that she knew would change everything, not just for her and Colton, but for Harlan and every man who wore his colors. A deputy answered on the 4th ring. Ridgeline County Sheriff's Department. My name is Lena Whitfield. I'm a social worker with the Department of Child Services badge number 7419. I need to report an active threat against a minor child and file a complaint regarding violations of a protective order by a man named Wade Prescott. She spoke for 12 minutes. She provided dates, times, locations, names. She detailed the attack on the warehouse, identifying Wade Prescott as the organizer and providing Briggs's testimony as corroborating evidence. She described Wade's history of domestic violence against Jolene Decker, citing police reports from 3 different jurisdictions that she had obtained through her professional contacts. She explained that Colton Decker, the minor child in question, was currently in her legal foster care, and that Wade Prescott had made explicit threats to take the boy by force. She did not mention the Hells Angels by name. She described the location where she and Colton were staying as a secure facility provided by concerned community members. She identified the men protecting them as private citizens acting in defense of a woman and child under documented threat. Every word she spoke was technically true, and the spaces between the truths were filled with the kind of careful omissions that 12 years in a broken system had taught her to construct. When she finished, the deputy asked if she wanted officers dispatched to her location. Yes, she said, but I need you to understand the situation. The people at this location are not the threat. They are protecting us from the threat. Wade Prescott has a history of violence, a documented pattern of intimidation, and he has already attempted one-armed assault on this location. If he discovers that law enforcement is involved, he may escalate. I need officers positioned nearby, but not visible until I give the word. Ma'am, that's not standard procedure. Deputy, there is an 8-year-old boy in this building who has already survived one shooting. I am asking you to help me make sure he doesn't have to survive another. I will take full responsibility for the coordination, but I need your people in position before noon today." There was a pause. Then the deputy transferred her to a sergeant, and Lena explained everything again with the same precision, and 20 minutes later, she had a commitment. 3 patrol units would be positioned on the streets surrounding the warehouse by 11 o'clock. An additional unit would be stationed near the courthouse where the custody hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. If Wade Prescott made any move toward the warehouse or the courthouse, he would be intercepted. Lena hung up and sat in the silence of the kitchen, feeling the adrenaline drain from her body like water from a cracked vessel. What she had just done was unprecedented in her experience. She had essentially merged 2 worlds that were never supposed to touch: the world of law enforcement and the world of outlaw bikers, and she had done it by standing in the narrow space between them and insisting that for one day, for one child, they could exist on the same side. The kitchen door opened and Harlan stood into the frame. He filled it completely, his shoulders brushing both sides, his head nearly touching the lintel. He looked at her, and she could tell from his expression that he already knew. "Bite monitors all outgoing calls," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered in the tone of a man who has just watched someone rearrange the furniture of his reality. "I called the sheriff's department. I know. I reported Wade Prescott. I provided evidence of his threats, his violence, and his connection to the attack on this warehouse. I did not identify your club. I described your men as community members providing protection for a woman and child under threat." Harlan crossed his arms. The leather of his vest creaked, and the patches on his chest caught the gray light from the kitchen window. "You invited cops to our front door. I invited the law to stand on your side. For the first time in your life, Harlan, the system is going to work for you instead of against you, but only if you let it. And if they come in here and start asking questions about things that don't have good answers, then I'll handle it. That's what I do. I navigate systems. I have been doing it for 12 years and I am very good at it. Your men can protect us from bullets. But Wade Prescott's real weapon isn't a gun. It's a lawyer and a custody petition, and the only way to beat that is with the same system he's trying to use." Harlan stared at her for a long time. His face was a landscape of competing emotions: suspicion and respect, fear and admiration. The instinct of a lifetime spent avoiding law enforcement, fighting against the growing recognition that this woman saw possibilities he had never considered. "You're asking me to trust a system that's never done anything but hunt us. I'm asking you to trust me." The words hung between them. Lena held his gaze without flinching, without softening, without any of the deference that his size and authority usually commanded. She met him as an equal, and she waited. Harlan uncrossed his arms. He ran a hand through his graying beard, and something in his posture shifted, not surrender, but acceptance, the recognition that the terrain of this battle had changed and that the woman standing in his kitchen understood it better than he did. "If this goes wrong," he said, "my men pay the price." "It won't go wrong. How can you be sure, Ditambu? Because I have been preparing for this my entire career. Every case I've built, every system I've learned to navigate, every fight I've fought with judges and bureaucrats and agencies that would rather process children than protect them. It all led here, to this moment, to this boy." Harlan looked at her, and what he saw was not the wounded woman he had carried out of a diner. It was not the frightened social worker who had woken up surrounded by bikers. It was someone else entirely. A woman who had taken the tools of a broken system and forged them into something that could cut. "All right," he said, "we do it your way." He turned to leave, then stopped. "But my men stay armed until Wade is in handcuffs. That's not negotiable. I wouldn't ask you to do anything else." The first sign that Wade Prescott was not going to wait for the courtroom came at 11:17 in the morning. Bite was the one who spotted it. His monitoring screen showed movement on the access roads to the east and south of the warehouse, vehicles that were not police and not civilian, moving in patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. He counted them, quickly relaying the information to Harlan with the clipped efficiency that crisis demanded. At least 30, coming from 2 directions. Heavy vehicles in the mix, not just bikes. Harlan's face went hard. He had been preparing for this possibility since Lena made her call, and his men were already in position, the defensive arrangements they had practiced, since the first attack, now reinforced with the desperate focus of people who understood that this time the enemy was bringing everything. "They're early," Harlan said, and there was something in his voice that went beyond tactical concern. "Wade knows about the hearing. He's coming before the courts can act." Lena felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had calculated the timing. The sheriff's units were in position. The hearing was in less than 3 hours. She had built her strategy on the assumption that Wade would choose the legal path because it was the smarter play, the move that would give him what he wanted without the risk of another armed confrontation. She had underestimated him. She had assumed he was rational, and she had forgotten the fundamental truth that she knew from 12 years of working with domestic abusers. They did not want custody. They did not want their children. They wanted control, and when control was threatened, they stopped being rational and became something much more dangerous. "Lena!" Harlan's hand closed around her arm, firm but not rough. "Take Colton and Jolene to the safe room. Now. I need to call the sheriff. They need to move in." "Do it from the safe room." "Harlan, please." The word came out like something he was not accustomed to saying, forced through a lifetime of giving orders rather than making requests. "Whatever happens out here, I need to know you're safe, all three of you." She looked at his face and saw the fear he was trying to hide. Not fear of Wade Prescott or his men or the violence that was approaching like a storm front. Fear of losing them. Fear of watching the family he had only just begun to reassemble be torn apart again. "I'll go," she said, "but I'm calling the sheriff first." She made the call in 45 seconds. She gave the coordinates, she described the approaching threat. She identified Wade Prescott by name, and she told the dispatcher that an armed assault on a location containing a minor child was imminent. Then she hung up and ran. Jolene was already in the hallway, her face white, but her jaw set with the same determination that Lena had seen in Harlan. She held Colton in her arms, and the boy was awake and alert, his eyes moving between the two women with the focused attention of a child who has learned to read adult fear the way other children read picture books. "This way," Lena said, leading them toward the reinforced room at the end of the corridor. The safe room was small, concrete walled, with a steel door that locked from the inside. Donna had stocked it with water blankets, a first aid kit, and a battery-powered radio tuned to the frequency that Harlan's men used. Lena pulled the door shut behind them and turned the lock, and the sound of the bolt sliding home was simultaneously the most reassuring and the most terrible sound she had ever heard. The first explosion came 30 seconds later. The building shook. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Colton pressed himself against Lena's chest, and she could feel his heart beating against her ribs, rapid and terrified, but still beating, still alive. Jolene crouched beside them, one hand on Colton's back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she could see through it to the chaos above. Through the radio, they heard everything. Harlan's voice commanding and constant, directing his men with the steady authority of someone who had been forged in combat and refined by decades of leading men through darkness. The staccato crack of gunfire. Shouts, the crash of barriers being breached, and beneath it all, the roar of engines, close and relentless. "Mommy," Colton whispered. "I'm here, sweetheart. Is Harlan going to be okay?" Lena looked at Jolene and their eyes met over Colton's head. In that look was everything they could not say to the boy. The uncertainty, the fear, the shared understanding that the man above them was fighting not for territory or reputation, but for the three people in this room, and that the cost of that fight might be more than any of them could bear. "Harlan is very strong," Lena said, "and he has his brothers with him." The radio crackled with Dawson's voice. "They're inside the east wing, at least 15 through the breach." Then Harlan, calm as stone, "Funnel them through the corridor. Moose, hold the stairwell. Nobody gets below ground level." More gunfire. Closer now. Then a sound that was different from the rest, a single voice cutting through the mechanical noise of combat with the raw, unfiltered rage of a man who had stopped thinking and started hunting. "Where's my son?" Wade Prescott's voice echoed through the building, distorted by the radio, but unmistakable in its fury. "Bring me my son." Jolene's hand tightened on Colton's back. Her face had gone gray, and Lena could see the tremor running through her body, the physical memory of years spent in the proximity of that voice and the violence it carried. "He can't get in here," Lena said firmly. "The door is reinforced. Harlan's men are between us and him, and the police are on their way." You don't know him, Jolene whispered. You don't know what he's capable of. I know exactly what he's capable of. I've read his file, I've seen the hospital records and the police reports and the photographs of what he did to you. And I have spent the last 3 days making sure that every piece of that evidence is in the hands of people who can stop him. He is not getting this boy. Not today, not ever. The conviction in her own voice surprised her. It came from a place deeper than professional confidence, deeper than the careful architecture of legal strategy. It came from the same place that had propelled her across Haggerty's diner, the same instinct that had turned her back to a gunman and wrapped her arms around a child she did not know. It was the voice of a woman who had found the thing she was willing to die for and had decided with absolute clarity to live for it instead. The radio went silent for a moment that stretched like a held breath, then a sound that Lena would remember for the rest of her life. Colton moved. He was out of her arms before she could react, his small body slipping through the narrow space between her and Jolene, with the desperate quickness of a frightened animal. He grabbed the door handle and pulled. Colton, no! But the lock was not complicated, and his fingers were fast, and the door swung open before either woman could reach him. He was through it and running down the corridor, his bare feet slapping against the concrete, his voice high and breaking as he screamed, "Daddy! Daddy! Stop! Don't hurt them!" He was not calling for Wade. He was calling for Harlan, the man he had come to know as his protector, the man whose lap he sat in while they built block towers, the man whose deep voice said good night to him every evening with a tenderness that belied everything the world saw when it looked at him. Lena was on her feet and running before the echo of his voice had faded. Jolene was right behind her, and they took the corridor at a sprint, following the sound of Colton's cries through the smoke and dust that had drifted down from the floors above. They found him in the main room. The space was unrecognizable. Overturned furniture, shattered glass bullet holes stitched across the brick walls in ragged lines. Smoke hung in layers, and the acrid smell of gunpowder burned Lena's throat. Through the haze, she could see figures moving, some of Harlan's men, some of Wade's, locked in the close-quarters chaos of people fighting in a space too small for the violence it contained. And in the center of it all, 3 figures. Harlan stood with his back to the far wall, blood running from a cut above his eye, his massive frame hunched with exhaustion, but still upright, still solid, still placing himself between danger and everything he loved. Across from him, Wade Prescott had emerged from the smoke, flanked by 2 men with weapons drawn. Wade was smaller than Lena had imagined, lean and coiled, with a face that might have been handsome once before rage carved permanent channels into it, before rage had carved permanent channels into its features. Between them, running toward Harlan with his arms outstretched, was Colton. "There's my boy," Wade said, and the smile on his face was the worst thing Lena had ever seen, because it contained no love at all. It was the smile of a man reclaiming property. "Come here, son." Colton did not even look at Wade. He ran straight to Harlan, wrapping his arms around the big man's waist, burying his face in the leather vest that smelled like motor oil and coffee, and the particular scent that Colton had come to associate with safety. Jolene broke past Lena and threw herself forward. She did not think. She did not calculate. She simply moved, placing her thin body between Wade's raised weapon and her son, with the same instinct that had driven Lena across a diner floor 13 days ago. The symmetry of it was almost poetic. 2 women in 2 different moments choosing the same thing. Choosing the child. "Move, Jolene." Wade's voice was flat and dead. "This doesn't concern you anymore." "Everything about him concerns me. He's my son. He's my son too, and I've got the papers to prove it." "Your papers mean nothing." Lena stepped into the open, her voice cutting through the smoke with an authority that made several men turn their heads. She walked forward, her hands at her sides, her back straight, moving toward the most dangerous man in the room, with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided that fear is no longer relevant. "I've submitted your entire history to the court. Domestic violence, criminal conspiracy, armed assault. By 2 o'clock this afternoon, your visitation rights will be terminated, and you will be facing charges in 3 jurisdictions. The sheriff's department is less than 4 minutes away. Whatever you think you are going to accomplish here, the only thing you're actually doing is adding to the list of reasons you will never see this boy again." Wade stared at her. His gun was still raised and his finger was on the trigger, and the space between them was small enough that he could not miss. But Lena did not flinch. She held his gaze the way she had held the gazes of every angry, dangerous, desperate person she had faced in 12 years of walking into homes where violence lived. She held it with the steady, unflinching certainty of a woman who knew that the most powerful weapon in this room was not made of metal. "You're bluffing," Wade said. "I never bluff. I build cases, and I'm very good at it." Something shifted in Wade's expression, a flicker of doubt quickly smothered by rage. He swung the gun toward Lena, and in that same instant, Harlan moved. The big man lunged forward, pulling Colton and Jolene behind his body, placing himself between the gun and his family with the same devastating simplicity that Lena had shown at the diner. Wade fired. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that seemed to compress the air itself. Harlan took the bullet in the chest. The impact knocked him backward. He staggered, his massive frame suddenly uncertain, his hands reaching for something to hold onto and finding nothing. His knees buckled, and he went down hard, the concrete floor receiving him with a finality that sent a shock through every person in the room. For one suspended moment, the fighting stopped. Every man on both sides froze, held in place by the sight of the mountain falling. Harlan Decker the Bear, the man who had seemed as permanent and immovable as the walls themselves, lay on the concrete floor with blood spreading beneath him in a dark tide. Then Dawson hit Wade from the side. The impact drove both men into a concrete pillar, and the gun skittered across the floor, and the remaining Hell's Angels converged on Wade's men with a fury that was no longer about strategy or tactics, but about something much more primal. Within seconds, it was over. Wade was pinned to the floor beneath three bikers, and his men were either restrained or fleeing through the breached wall into the approaching sound of sirens. Because the sirens were coming. Lena could hear them now growing louder with every second, and the sound was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard, more beautiful than music, more beautiful than laughter, more beautiful than anything except the shallow, ragged breathing of the man on the floor who was still alive. Lena dropped to her knees beside Harlan. The blood was coming from the left side of his chest, and her hands were shaking as she pressed them against the wound, feeling the warm pulse of it between her fingers. His eyes were open, staring at the industrial ceiling, and his breathing was the shallow, labored breathing of a body fighting to maintain what it had done automatically for 62 years. "Don't you dare," she said, and her voice cracked for the first time since the shooting at the diner. "Don't you dare leave him." Harlan's eyes found hers. The pain was there, enormous and obvious, but behind it was something else. Peace, the expression of a man who had just done the thing he was put on earth to do. "Did I get them clear?" he whispered. "They're safe. Colton and Jolene are safe. You got them clear." Jolene was beside them now, her hands gripping her father's arm, her face a ruin of tears and terror. Dad, stay with me. Please stay with me." Harlan's eyes moved to his daughter, and his free hand found hers. The grip was weak, nothing like the iron certainty that had characterized every gesture he had made in Lena's presence. But it was there. "You have to choose now, Jolene," he said, and each word cost him something visible. "This life or your son. You can't have both. Not anymore." "I choose him," Jolene said, and there was no hesitation, no calculation, no pause for breath. "I choose Colton. I chose him the day I got clean, and I choose him now, and I will choose him every day for the rest of my life." Harlan's face softened, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. He looked at Lena, and his hand moved from his side to cover hers, where it pressed against his wound. "Take care of my family," he said. "Your family includes you," Lena said fiercely. "So you're going to stay alive and help me do it." She looked up. Griff was already there, his medical bag open, his hands moving with the speed and precision that the Gulf War had burned into his muscle memory. He cut away Harlan's shirt and examined the wound, and the expression on his face told Lena what she needed to know before he said a word. "Bullet's still in there, close to the heart, but I don't think it hit it. Lungs compromised. He needs a hospital, not a warehouse. The ambulance is coming. The sheriff's units will have called it in." Lena pressed harder on the wound, willing the blood to stop, willing the heart beneath her hands to keep beating. "You hold on, Harlan Decker. You hold on, because that boy up there just called you daddy, and he meant it, and you are not going to make him lose another person. Not today." The paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, rushing through the warehouse entrance alongside sheriff's deputies, who took in the scene with the wide-eyed assessment of people who had not been briefed on the full scope of what they were walking into. Lena met them with blood on her hands and an authority in her voice that left no room for questions. The wounded man is Harlan Decker, gunshot wound to the left chest. The shooter is Wade Prescott, restrained by the far wall. Prescott is the subject of an active complaint filed this morning, case number on file with your dispatch. The men in this building are community members who acted in defense of themselves and a minor child. I am Lena Whitfield, Department of Child Services, and I have documentation for everything I just told you. The paramedics took Harlan. Lena watched them load him onto the stretcher, watched his massive frame diminish against the white sheets, watched his eyes flutter closed as the morphine took him away from the pain and into whatever space exists between consciousness and its absence. Jolene walked beside the stretcher, holding her father's hand, and Colton held Lena's hand, and they moved through the ruined warehouse like a family leaving a house that had been destroyed by a storm, carrying nothing but each other. Wade Prescott was taken from the building in handcuffs. Lena watched him go, watched the deputies guide his head into the back of the patrol, and watched the door close with a sound that was quiet and final, and completely unlike the explosions and gunfire that had preceded it. He did not look at her. He did not look at anyone. He stared straight ahead with the blank, deflated expression of a man who has just discovered that the world is not organized for his convenience. At the hospital, the doctors worked for 4 hours. Lena sat in the waiting room with Colton in her lap and Jolene beside her and 20 Hells Angels filling every available chair and a significant portion of the floor. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Their presence was itself a language, a statement of loyalty and solidarity that needed no translation. When the surgeon emerged, her scrubs marked with the evidence of her work, her face carried the particular expression of a medical professional delivering news that was better than expected, but still serious. The bullet missed his heart by less than an inch. It nicked the pericardium but didn't penetrate. We've removed it and repaired the damage. He's stable, but the next 24 hours are critical. Lena closed her eyes. The relief that washed through her was so intense it was almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that has been numb. They let her see him the next morning. He lay in the hospital bed looking smaller than she had ever seen him, which was still considerably larger than most people. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beeped and hummed with the quiet diligence of technology doing its job. His face was pale, his beard unkempt, and his eyes, when they opened, were clouded with medication, but unmistakably his. "You're still here," he said. "Where else would I be?" She sat beside his bed and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and the grip was weak but warm, and the contact felt like an anchor holding both of them steady against a current that had been trying to sweep them away. "The boys," he said, "my men. Are they all right?" "Everyone's alive. Fielding has a broken leg. Webb is in the room down the hall stable. Moose has enough bruises to qualify as modern art. But they're all here. They haven't left the building." His eyes drifted to the window where the morning light was gray and soft. "And Jolene Colton?" "Jolene is in the cafeteria with Colton. She hasn't left the hospital since you were shot." Lena paused, choosing her words with care. "She's different, Harlan. She's not the girl you lost. She's someone new, someone who chose her son when it mattered most." Tears appeared in Harlan's eyes, and he did not try to hide them. This man who had built a reputation on strength and silence and the careful suppression of everything soft let the tears fall without apology, and Lena watched them trace the deep lines of his face and disappear into his beard. "I thought I'd lost her forever," he whispered. "When she chose the drugs over everything, over Colton, over me, it broke something inside that I didn't think could be fixed. Sometimes we have to break completely before we can be rebuilt." "Like you." Lena's breath caught. She looked at their joined hands at the IV line at the machines measuring the distance between life and its absence. "My brother died because I couldn't save him," she said. "And I spent 12 years trying to save everyone else to make up for it. But you can't save everyone. You can only be there. You can only hold space for people while they find their way back." She squeezed his hand. "You did that for me when I woke up in your warehouse. You held space. And now your daughter is finding her way back. And you—" His eyes found hers with an intensity that the medication could not diminish. "What did you find?" "A family," she said simply. "The most unlikely, most stubborn, most terrifying family I could have imagined. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." His thumb moved across her palm, a small gesture, that contained more tenderness than most people express in a lifetime of grand declarations. "You showed me there's another way," he said. "All my life I solved problems with force, with my fists, my men, my reputation. You walked into a room full of outlaws and changed everything with a phone call and 3 file folders. And 4 bullet scars." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh if his body had been in any condition to produce one. "Yeah," he said, "in those." They sat together in the quiet hospital room while the machines beeped and the morning light strengthened, and somewhere down the hall, Colton ate scrambled eggs in the cafeteria with his mother, his real mother, who was learning to be present in his life one small moment at a time. The custody hearing took place 4 days later in a small courtroom in Ridgeline that smelled like old wood and carpet cleaner. Lena wore a dark blue suit that she had borrowed from Janet Paulson, and she carried 3 folders that contained the most carefully constructed legal argument of her career. Wade Prescott's lawyer, a man named Sheridan from Portland, presented his case first. He spoke about parental rights and biological connection and the importance of maintaining the father-child bond. He referenced the custody petition and the visitation order and the legal framework that supported his client's claim. Then it was Lena's turn. She did not raise her voice. She did not make dramatic gestures. She simply opened her folders and laid out the evidence with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent 12 years learning to speak the language of courts and judges and systems. She presented the police reports documenting Wade's violence against Jolene. She presented hospital records showing injuries consistent with long-term domestic abuse. She presented Briggs' testimony connecting Wade to organized criminal activity. She presented the records of the armed assaults on the warehouse, including ballistics evidence linking Wade's weapons to both attacks. And she presented her own credentials, her background, her professional assessment of Colton's needs, and the emergency foster care order that had been legally in effect for over a week. The judge listened to everything. He asked questions, he examined documents, and at the end of the hearing, he ruled. Wade Prescott's visitation rights were terminated immediately and permanently. A restraining order was issued prohibiting him from approaching Colton, Jolene, or Lena within 1,000 feet. His pending custody petition was denied with prejudice, and Lena Whitfield was confirmed as Colton Decker's legal foster parent with a structured visitation plan allowing Jolene supervised contact as she continued her recovery. Lena walked out of the courtroom into the afternoon sun, and the first thing she saw was a line of motorcycles parked along the curb. 20 Hells Angels stood beside their bikes, their leather vests and patches visible from a block away, their arms crossed and their faces wearing expressions that ranged from stoic to openly emotional. When they saw her emerge from the courthouse steps, they did not cheer. They did not shout. One by one they nodded, and in that simple gesture, a row of weathered men acknowledging a woman who had won a battle with paper instead of bullets, Lena felt the full weight of what had been accomplished. Harlan was not among them. He was still in the hospital, watching the proceedings through a video call that Byte had set up on a laptop propped against a pillow. But when Lena checked her phone, there was a text message from his number. "Told you, bravest woman I ever met." The weeks that followed were a study in transformation. Not the sudden dramatic transformation of stories, but the slow, uneven, sometimes frustrating kind that happens in real life where progress comes in inches and setbacks come without warning. And the only thing that keeps you moving forward is the stubborn refusal to go back. Harlan was released from the hospital after 10 days. He moved slowly, his left side stiff and painful, his breathing still shallow when he exerted himself. But he moved. He returned to the warehouse which his men had been repairing with the same determination they had once applied to defending it, and he stood in the main room looking at the patched walls and the new windows and the fresh concrete that covered the places where blood had stained the floor. "Doesn't look the same," he said. "It's not supposed to," Lena replied. "That's the point." The Hells Angels began their transition with the awkwardness of men learning a new language. Harlan organized the first community event 3 weeks after his release, a food drive that partnered with the local food bank to distribute supplies to families in need throughout Ridgeline. His men showed up in their leather vests and heavy boots, and the food bank volunteers eyed them with the wariness of people who had spent their lives on the other side of a very thick line. But the bikers worked. They loaded bodies and drove deliveries and carried groceries into the homes of elderly residents who could not carry them themselves. And by the end of the day, the wariness had begun to soften. More events followed. A toy drive for the children's shelter, a fundraiser for medical bills at the community hospital. A crew of bikers spending a Saturday repairing the roof of the local church, their tattooed arms wielding hammers and roofing nails, while the pastor stood below, shaking his head in amiable disbelief. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said to Lena, who had become the unofficial coordinator of the club's charitable efforts. "Neither did they," she said, "but sometimes people just need permission to be who they really are." The local pastor arrived one afternoon carrying boxes of donated clothes. "The congregation sent these," he announced, "and they want to know if your men could help build shelves for the community pantry next weekend." "Count us in," Harlan said without hesitation. "We'll bring our tools and every man who can swing a hammer." Jolene found her path. She could not yet be the mother that Colton needed her to be, and she had the courage and the honesty to admit it. Instead, she channeled her energy into the recovery community, volunteering at a treatment center in the next town, sharing her story with people who were standing at the same crossroads she had faced. She visited Colton twice a week, and their relationship grew slowly like a plant finding its way toward light. She did not call herself his mother. She called herself Jolene. And Colton, with the adaptability of children who have been loved well enough to feel safe, began to reach for her hand. Sometimes began to ask her questions, began to include her in the drawings he made of his family. The drawings grew more elaborate as the weeks passed. Stick figures with leather vests, a large figure with a beard labeled Harlan, a tall figure labeled Moose, and always at the center, two figures holding hands, one labeled Mommy, one labeled Me. Lena found her apartment 3 months after the shooting, a small place on Elm Street with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen window that looked out onto a quiet street lined with maple trees. She painted Colton's room blue because he asked for blue, and she hung his drawings on the refrigerator with magnets shaped like motorcycles that Moose had given him as a housewarming gift. The evening they moved in, Colton stood in the middle of his new room and turned in a slow circle, taking in the blue walls and the bed, with the checkered quilt and the shelf that Harlan had built for him, working carefully with one pawned arm while his chest healed. "This is mine," he asked. "This is yours. And you'll be right there." He pointed toward the door, meaning her room, meaning the proximity that was the only thing that kept his nightmares manageable. "Right there." He sat on the bed and bounced twice, testing it. Then he looked up at her with an expression that was older than his 8 years, an expression that contained the memory of an empty apartment and a missing mother, and the sound of gunfire, and the feeling of being held by someone who chose to stay. "I love you, Mommy." "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you know." She tucked him in that night and sat beside his bed until his breathing deepened into sleep. Then she walked to the living room window and looked out at the street. Harlan was there. He stood beside his motorcycle on the opposite sidewalk, his massive silhouette outlined against the glow of the streetlight. He had been there every night since they moved in, a silent guardian, keeping watch from a distance that was close enough to protect and far enough to give them space. His leather vest was zipped against the evening chill, and the patches on his chest caught the light when he shifted his weight. Colton had noticed him earlier during dinner and had waved from the kitchen window with the enthusiastic energy of a boy who has not yet learned that some relationships are complicated. Harlan had waved back, and the sternness that was his default expression had dissolved into something warm and unguarded, a smile that reached his eyes and softened every hard line on his face. Now Lena raised her hand and Harlan raised his. They stood like that for a moment, separated by a street and connected by everything that had happened on the other side of it. The diner, the bullets, the warehouse, the bikers who became brothers, the daughter who came home, the boy who found a mother in the last place anyone would have looked. Lena let her hand fall. She looked at the apartment around her. The walls that held Colton's drawings and photographs of birthday celebrations and candid moments captured by men who looked like they should be on wanted posters, but who had learned slowly and imperfectly to build instead of break. A framed photograph on the bookshelf showed Colton sitting on Harlan's motorcycle, both of them grinning at the camera, and beside it was a smaller frame holding a picture that Jolene had given her of Arno. A picture of a 12-year-old girl in a softball uniform holding a trophy, smiling with the confidence of a child who still believed the world would be kind. Lena touched the frame with her fingertips. Then she turned off the living room light and walked to her bedroom, pausing at Colton's door to listen to his breathing. Steady, deep, peaceful. The breathing of a child who is not afraid. She was not the woman she had been 3 months ago. She was not the careful professional who kept the world at a measured distance, who filed cases and followed protocols and went home to an empty apartment where the silence was a reminder of all the people she could not save. She was something else now. Something that had been forged in a diner's checkered floor and tempered in a warehouse full of outlaws and finished in a courtroom where 3 folders full of paper had accomplished what guns and violence could not. She was a mother. She was part of a family that no one would have predicted, and no one could have designed a family built not on blood, but on the simple, radical act of choosing to stay, of choosing to show up, of choosing to hold on when every sensible instinct said to let go. Outside, the street was quiet. The maple trees stood dark against the sky, and across the road, Harlan Decker kept his watch, a man who had spent his life being feared, learning one night at a time what it meant to be loved. He would stand there until the lights went out and the house was still, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a town settling into sleep. Then he would ride home slowly through streets that were beginning to feel like they belonged to him in a way they never had before. Not because he owned them, but because he had helped to build something good in them, something worth protecting, something that proved against all evidence and expectation that it is never too late to become the person you were supposed to be.